Hello everyone. So this will be a very brief PowerPoint to just discuss the major terms from Chapter 3, talking about similarities and differences between the two main genders we typically talk about. So certainly in Chapter 4, we'll talk about how there's more going on than just that. So gender essentialism is this assumption that there's something fundamentally different about men and women, and that difference is biological, genetic. There's nothing we can do to change it. It's immutable. And in recent times, this has even been translated into how biological research, especially brain-based research, is conducted and presented. Cordelia Fine, whom there's a video from on your Blackboard, talks about this as neurosexism. The idea that there are fixed biologically based differences between women and men, and that they're somehow in the brain, and that's used as a means to justify or reinforce gender stereotypes, when in fact, when you look at these data on a large population level, as for example, Rebecca Jordan-Young has as an epidemiologist, all these differences sort of just wash out in the data. And research very commonly, over and over, actually shows that women and men are more similar than different. But the popular media tends to focus on the differences, even small ones, because that's sort of what sells. That's what we expect, right? And there's also something called the file drawer problem, where it's harder to get things published if you don't have significant results. So if you don't find gender differences, oftentimes that doesn't get published. So that just obviously contributes to the neurosexism, because all those non-gender difference findings aren't out there actually being published. There's a bunch of different perspectives on this. There's the similarities perspective that most feminist psychologists take, the idea that women and men are more similar than different. There's the differences perspective, which emphasizes gender difference so that people appreciate and value women's unique experiences and attributes. This is more in line with cultural feminism that we talked about last module. And then there's strategic essentialism, which is a strategic support of gender essentialism to help support social causes that uniquely affect large numbers of women. So if you see people talking about gender differences, you really need to ask yourself these 4 questions. Does everybody show this difference? So if you were to look at people of different races, different classes, different ages, are there always these gender differences? Does the difference change in different contexts, right? If it changes in different contexts, it's not immutable, it's not biological, right? It's based on your social situation. So for example, if you looked at math scores on the SAT, right, you might think, oh, women are so much worse than men at math. But if you look at grades in math classes, women consistently score higher than men. So you need to look at the context. And is the difference categorical, where women are one way and men are the other way? Or is it dimensional, where there are differences that are a matter of degree and probably some overlap between those two, right? And what is the source of the difference? So even if there is a gender difference, and the data is consistently showing that, why? Right? Just because we consistently find a gender difference doesn't mean it's caused by our brains or our genes, right? It could very easily be gender socialization. So evolutionary psychology has tried to explain these differences. There are a lot of problems with evolutionary psychology in terms of really just focusing, I think, way too much on mate selection behavior and assuming that all people are the same, which as psychologists we know is not true, right? Sexual strategies theory suggests that gender differences in mate selectivity help ensure survival of the species. This is often referred to as mating widely for men, spreading their sperm around as much as they want, and mating wisely for women, finding a partner who will help support the raising of offspring. There's also differential parental investment theory that suggests that women's greater investment in children is due to their greater contributions to parenting through gestating and breastfeeding. Then there's this idea of attachment fertility theory that suggests that early human survival was enhanced when women and men worked together to ensure survival of their offspring. And if you think about sort of modern ideas about it takes a village, right, to raise a child, it kind of even goes beyond this, right? Now, in terms of other biological explanations, one is brain plasticity. So until really the 1990s, so not that long ago, we thought that the number of neurons and connections between them you were born with is what you were stuck with for the rest of your life. And in the 90s, we really started to realize, like, oh no, the brain has plasticity. It's able to change in response to aspects of the environment and in response to what we learn. So therefore, based on that, brain differences could actually be the result of different experiences. So even if we find consistent brain differences between men and women, we don't know that those are biologically entirely caused, right? We don't know that's because of genes. It could be because men and women have completely different social experiences in our current society. The way that my intro psychology professor, when I was back in undergrad, explained this to us is genes are expressed in an environment. So yes, there are genetic factors, but they come out in different ways. And the clearest way to think about this in terms of like a physical thing that we think you can't really alter based on environment is height, right? So your genes might determine how tall you're supposed to be, but if you are in an environment where you're completely malnourished, you may never grow to the 6 foot you're supposed to be and stay my height, 5'4", right? So genes are affected by the environment we're in. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because we tend to think of genes as like just computer programming and we just hit a return and it goes, but they really do interact with our environment quite a bit. Similarly, hormones have a really complicated relationship with behavior. So we tend to, in our society, sort of just pass things off as being hormonal. But we know that behavior also affects our hormones, and there are parts of the brain that affect our hormones. So they're affected by the plasticity. So we know there might be a correlation, but for those of you who have taken like statistics or even intro psych, you've probably heard that correlation does not mean causation. So just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other. So social role theory, also called social structural theory, emphasizes how gender roles are responses to different roles in society. Gender roles are not the causes of different roles in society. Essentially, because of what society has laid out for us, we enact what we are told we are supposed to enact. So traditional roles have led to the development of potential personality differences or even cognitive differences. So, and some people even argue physical differences. So for example, the fact that, women may not be as athletic as men may be due to the fact that for years and years, women weren't allowed to compete, right? And so therefore they didn't get the chance to hone their bodies in that way. But example that's commonly used is that, oh, women are natural nurturers and caregivers. Well, being a caregiver and beginning that role of expectation from a very young age is what's going to make you more nurturing. It's not that you're inherently more nurturing. And there's expectancy role value theory. And this is that people make decisions about what activities to pursue based on the expectation that doing the activity will lead to success and the value that the person puts on the activity. So, we're going to choose what activities to engage in based on what's socially acceptable and what we think we'll do well at because of what's socially acceptable. So this focuses on how environmental factors and gender socialization promote these sex-gender differences. And women may then behave based on these internalized stereotypes about how they're supposed to act. It's essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy that you do what you are expected to do. Now, looking at the data, the big picture. So a meta-analysis, if you're not familiar, is where you take a bunch of other published data and each study becomes a data point. So each study is essentially like a participant. And then you compare across all those different studies. Janet Hyde is like the rock star of this. She has done a ton of amazing meta-analyses, very respected psychologist in general, not to mention feminist psychologist. I saw her speak at APA and she said, "I fight not with my fists, but with data." So that tells you where her social justice comes in and what she shows through the data that exists. She's not tweaking any of this. She's just running analyses. So she did a study of meta-analyses. So it was like a meta-analysis. And she found that 78% of gender sex differences were negligible or small. Right? So, and that's with the existing data that we have, with measures that may be biased. These things aren't really panning out when we look at the bigger picture. Another more recent one, a meta-synthesis of these meta-analyses, found that 85, almost 86% of the sex gender differences were negligible or small. That 90% of men and women overlapped on these different issues they looked at. So again, despite a bias towards reporting and emphasizing sex and gender differences, the data actually show far, far more similarities. Part of what happens on the two people, right, who are trying to maybe break out of some of these stereotypes is that there are biases based on sex gender, based on disability, based on race, based on socioeconomic status, based on who your parents are, what college you went to, right? These contribute to differential expectations for women, for, again, people of different minority statuses, in specifically STEM fields in particular, but also in lots of other fields. So a self-fulfilling prophecy, which we just mentioned, when you believe something about a person enough, or you believe it about yourself, you sort of speak it into being, essentially. It's going to influence your behavior, and it makes those expectations, unfortunately, become a reality. There's also this idea of the model minority. So seemingly positive stereotypes about certain minorities. So for example, that Asian American people are hardworking, smart, overachieving, good at math. This is benevolent racism, right? It's still racism, it's still problematic. We have this image in our head that a scientist is a white man in a lab coat, right? And anyone who doesn't fit that stereotype can be discouraged, unwelcome, or experience outright discrimination. Stereotype threat is the idea that when people think their social group does poorly on something, or others think that that's true, their anxiety about confirming that stereotype can undermine their performance. It's like they're worried so much about it they can't perform as well as they typically would. So for example, there are experiments they've done where they tell women before they take a math test, oh, you know, there are sex gender differences on this. Or just if you have to fill out a demographics form and identify yourself as a woman before you do it, you do worse on the test. Something we really need to consider about psychologists when we do these types of things, right? Asian American women who were prompted to think about their gender did worse on a math test, but if they were prompted to think about their race, they did better. Again, more fuel to add to the idea that the environment and the context really matter, right? Tokenism can also be very problematic. A token is a member of a socially marginalized group whose group makes up less than 15% of the workforce. Women experience tokenism, people of different minority statuses experience tokenism, and it's very stressful. There's a lot of negative effects. So your increased visibility leads to more people scrutinizing your work, which, you know, obviously can lead to more anxiety, more double checking, makes you less efficient. There's a lot of pressure to represent all people of your group really well. There can be social isolation. You don't have mentors to look up to, right? And you're seen in sex gender stereotyped ways. So there are studies showing that even in these STEM type fields, women are asked to do much more of what's called the office housework. You know, can you do these copies? Can you make the coffee for the meeting? All right, so that is it for the basic terms for this chapter. Please enjoy discussing these as we go forward, and I look forward to seeing you in the second half of the module.